We're talking about what does a disciple look like? And the answer really is anybody. Anybody can look like a disciple. But the Bible uses physical attributes to describe a disciple. Now, that isn't to say that there are certain eyes that look like a disciple, or certain mouth, or certain hands or feet, but he uses physical descriptions for us to then look at ourselves and be reminded of all the spiritual attributes that we should have. So last week we had started with the forefront of the topic, which is eyes. If you want to paint a portrait, you got to get the eyes right. If you get the eyes wrong, then you're going to have some weird alien-looking portrait, and it's never going to look like the person. You can get all the other attributes, but if you miss the eyes in a portrait, game over. You're just not going to do very well. So we want to move on from there into a topic that the Bible talks about as being one of the paramount virtues or characteristics of a disciple. And he uses, again, more physical attributes. Here in James chapter 1, we're going to look right to the end of the chapter. James chapter 1, there in verse 26. He says, "If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless." Now, he uses the word tongue. We're going to substitute that for mouth for the sake of the lesson and continuity with all the other verses. And I hope that you guys are understanding of that a little bit of changing. The mouth is a terribly important aspect of our body. Now, that's not to say that people who are mute have things inherently better, or that all these things we're going to be talking about today don't apply. But a mouth is the way that we know one another. I can be around you and I can spend time with you, but if we never communicate, if we never talk back and forth, then I don't actually get to know you at all. Our lights don't shine around us if we don't talk. We don't get to form intimacy and build relationships without communication. And James talks about that when it comes to our spiritual life. This is one of the forefront things of our spirituality, is how do we communicate? And James says this. He says, if anyone thinks that he is religious. Now, this is my assumption. I don't know everybody here, but I'm assuming that if we're here today, if you guys are on vacation, you take time out of your vacation to come and to worship on Sunday, that probably is us, right? This verse is probably speaking to us. If you think that you are religious and you do not bridle your tongue, then your religion isn't worth nearly as much as you thought it was worth. But that isn't what James says. He says your religion is worth nothing. That is a really, really bold, really strong statement of how important the mouth is. That if you go through all the process of going to services and you praise God on Sunday, and you give him the plate, and you take the Lord's Supper, and maybe you make a Bible class on Wednesday or Thursday or Tuesday, whatever night your midweek Bible study is, and that you talk to your coworkers and your neighbors about religion, and you try to practice a lot of principles of being spiritual, and yet you do not harness your tongue, everything else is worthless. That is such a bold claim of James. But as we know, he doesn't make that of his own. But James doesn't say, well, I think today I'm going to write down your religion is worthless. This is inspired by the Holy Spirit. God is telling us that if you do everything else and you don't bridle your tongue, then your religion is worthless. Getting this attribute right is important. This is an important aspect. This is how our light is going to shine in the world around us. This is how we build our families up. This is how we build our relationship between our spouses up. This is how we mend problems in the local church, and we build that bond of fellowship and the unity of the Spirit. That comes through the tongue. This is how we teach somebody. We mentioned this in Bible class, that if you arrange all of this perfume in your life, and yet you throw that tongue unbridled in there, that one little dead ointment, it's going to ruin everything else. That if you are trying to teach someone and they see the hypocrisy in your speech, that's it, game over. There's nothing else that they're going to want to hear from you. If you do not bridle your tongue, then you missed a lot. And it makes everything else worthless. For a disciple to truly look like a disciple, he has to have the mouth that Christ gives us. One that is controlled, one that is pure in speech. If you turn over one page, maybe 2 pages to James chapter 3. Starting there in verse 2, James reminds us that we all stumble in many ways. James starts us off at a pretty humble position. He doesn't say, well, I stumble in one way, maybe two ways. He says we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. For we put bits into the mouth of horses so that they obey us, and we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, and yet it boasts of great things. And how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among its members, staining the whole body and setting on fire the entire course of life. And it's set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird and reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. For from the same mouth comes blessings and cursings. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Or can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. He makes the point that our mouths guide us. You control that, and you get to control everything else. How often do we step into huge aspects of sin in our lives without talking it over first, without dipping our tongues in by the speech of those things? How many people walk in and say, today is the day that I'm going to start an adulterous affair on my family, without ever having a communication beforehand? Your speech guides in that way. He gives the two examples, both here of a ship and a horse. Now, I mentioned this before, that I like my horsepower the old-fashioned way with a throttle and an engine. He's talking about the other horsepower, just the single horsepower. You get to control an entire horse by just 2.5 inches of metal. That's it. The entire horse. All of its crazy madness that is contained inside of a horse. 2.5 pieces of metal. That's it. For a ship, I forget to do the calculations every time we talk over James chapter 3. It's like less than 1% of the entire mass of a ship is contained within the rudder. And you get to control the entire ship with that. Such is the tongue. And what he calls for here in James chapter 2 is a purity of speech. He mentions this idea as you get down into verses 9 and following. He mentions that we have this habit as people to bless God. This is the Sunday morning speech, followed by the Monday morning speech. Then we curse man who's made in the image of God. Then we're happy to praise God here and sing all the songs that John has led us in this morning. And then as soon as we get cut off in traffic, then we're going to curse them to high heavens because how dare they? And there's the irony there in verse 9. They were made in God's likeness. You bless him, and then you curse the one who's made in his likeness. These things ought not to be so. From the same mouth comes blessings and cursings. And he asks the question, just does nature show this to us? In verse 11, have you ever gone to a spring and you drank from it and it was good water? My wife's family is from the north central Florida area where all like the Florida bottled water comes from. That's where they're from. Their well water is amazing spring water. But there's never been a time that we turned the taps on down there and salt water came out. It's never happened. And it's not going to happen because that isn't nature. There's never been a point in time where I've gone to a fig tree and pulled off grapes. Doesn't happen. The question comes up for us. If God has designed us for pure speech, why is it that we don't do that? Why do we pour forth both blessings and cursings? Why is it that we don't have speech without filth? Dirty language, crude humor, inappropriate topics, all of those things should be something that is not contained inside of us. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, in verse 16, when Paul writes to Timothy, he writes in his second letter of two individuals. He tells them to avoid Hymenaeus and Philetus in verse 17, whose talk spreads like gangrene. I don't think that gangrene is something that we are overly familiar with. I don't know too many people who have had gangrenous growths on them. If you want to have a disturbing image while you eat lunch today, just go ahead and Google search gangrene, and you get an idea what he's talking about. He says their speech spreads like gangrene. It's this vomitous, nasty, vile speech that spreads. And once it touches, it corrodes, and it begins to go from there. That's them. And he mentions that avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene, among whom are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who swerve from the truth, that they say the resurrection has already happened, and they're upsetting the faith of some. And he makes the point that God knows who are his. Here they have swerved from the truth by their speech, by their mouth, and their speech spreads like gangrene. We are called as Christians to have a speech that is wholly given over to cleanness. People should know that we are Christians, that we are disciples of Christ, by the things that we don't say, that our speech is pure. That should be something that is notable about us. But that isn't where it ends. If you go over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. I want to look at verses 21 and verse 22. It's one thing not to have gangrenous speech, but it's another thing to have honesty. And we're called to have both of those things. Here in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting there in verse 21 and verse 22, he says, "For to this you have been called. For Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth." What does it look like to have a mouth of Christ? To take a step back from there real quick, have you ever wondered why Jesus came at a time period where there's no cameras? Why is it that nobody took time to paint his portrait? Because it doesn't matter what he looks like. That's just the case of it. But we are called to look like him in all of his character attributes. And what he tells us here in verse 21, he says, to this you were called. You were called to talk like him. And that includes here in verse 22, committing no sin, and then having no deceit found in your mouth. I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, that you can be technically honest while being completely deceitful. And Peter removes that possibility. I'm going to give you a half-truth. It's true, but it's definitely designed to deceive you. He says there was no deceit in Jesus' mouth. He could have said there was no lying, and then, well, maybe we could talk ourselves into some gray room. We could find some gray areas, some squidgy spots, and we can work with that. But he removes all of that by saying that there was no deceit found in Jesus' mouth. And to this you were called. Being individuals who have no deceit is important. Paul mentions in Colossians chapter 3 that we must put away all lying. There in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 9 and verse 10, he says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off your old self with its practices, and you have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of our Creator." He says your old portrait, what everyone saw in you before, what they recognized in you before, that all the lying belongs to that person. And that's done away with. You have to leave that man buried. If you ever consider the process of someone who is crucified with Christ and then buried with him, that process of baptism, where you're crucified, buried, and then resurrected to a new life, that old man of sin, he's got to stay buried. You can't resurrect him and keep living in him anymore. He's got to stay there. And he mentions that here in verse 10, that you have been renewed after the knowledge, after the image of your Creator. He calls you to look like Christ. And part of that is to put away all lying. No longer a part of us. I was reading a book just yesterday, actually. And one of the contributors. It was an oral history book where they had taken about 2,000 eyewitness accounts and pieced together the story of 9/11. It's a really hard book to get through. But the one person said, he loved me enough to lie to me. And that is a pretty common thing that we find in our society. Individuals who, they love me enough to lie to me. It's so nice, so sweet. That isn't the case. We as Christians are never to talk ourselves into being someone who loves somebody enough to lie to them. We are to be individuals who speak the truth in love. If you're there in Colossians, a couple pages back in Ephesians chapter 4, there in verse 15, that the church, as it starts to build itself up together, he mentions here in Ephesians chapter 4, there in verse 15, he says in verse 14, we are no longer children, we're tossed to and fro by the waves and carried along by every wind of doctrine and human cunning and craftiness and deceitful schemes. But rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, who is joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, it makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. There is one thing to say, well, let's stop lying. And then there's the next step that says, let's start speaking truth in love. And all of the words are important. In case if you've kind of wondered about that, all of the words are important. Sometimes we want to cherry pick some of those words and say, well, I want to speak the truth, and I don't care how you receive it. Or I don't care how I come off. As long as I speak the truth, then I have done my job. But he talks here, he says that you need to speak the truth in love. And by that, we are to grow up in every way into Christ. All of the words are important. And so there's this process that we have here throughout Colossians and into Ephesians, that lying, that belongs to the old man of sin. And sometimes we take that first step and say, I'm no longer going to be deceitful. And that is a fantastic first step. But that doesn't mean that we've arrived yet. The next step is then to speak the truth in love. We do a really good job sometimes of just keeping our mouth shut and hoping that by keeping our mouth shut, problems will go away and problems will be smoothed over and sins will be handled on their own or just magically dissolve. There's a lot of truth-telling that needs to happen in a church for it to grow, to build itself up. There is no way for a church to grow if the truth isn't being spoken to one another, by one another. Issues cannot be resolved without them being exposed to the light. Sin doesn't go away until someone brings it out into the open. And that's what Paul's talking about here in Ephesians chapter 4. When it comes to us being individuals who look like Christ, our mouth has to be a mouth that speaks truth. When Jesus enters into a town throughout the Gospels, you don't see him just going in there and being loving to people or gentle with them and never saying a word about their sins. It doesn't happen. For them to be radically changed, he had to speak the truth. And you see him do it in the most loving way possible. We are to be like him in that way. In Romans chapter 10, in a slightly different but not different vein, he makes the point in verse 10 that with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And we have this probably in maybe a little note in the back of our Bible or in the front of our Bible, that when we go through the 5 steps of salvation with somebody, we hit Romans chapter 10, verse 10, right on the way, like Acts chapter 2, verse 38, or 1 Peter chapter 3, 21. It's one of our hopping steps. We never stop and talk about it a whole lot. So let's stop and talk about it for a second. This confession in Romans chapter 10, verse 10, I don't believe it's a one-time deal. I don't think it's you do it while the preacher's holding his hand up right before he dunks you. This is an attribute of someone who confesses Jesus on a regular basis. And I think some of our friends in the denominations do a better job of giving their testimony, you might say, or confessing him before other people. We are happy sometimes to talk about how I'm a Christian and I believe in non-instrumental music, and I believe in, and we list off all the things that kind of make us different, and sometimes we forget to really confess Jesus as he is. In fact, in Matthew chapter 10, there in verse 32 and 33, Matthew chapter 10, there in verse 32 and verse 33, Jesus says, "Everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." Verse 32 is an active verse. You do this. It's not a passive verse that, oh, I see you, I think you're probably a Christian. That's good enough. This is an active process. We have opportunities on a regular basis. Usually Monday mornings seem to be that one of those times of, how was your weekend? What'd you get to do? And, well, we went to Williamsburg, and we went to the beach, and we ate ice cream, and we had a good cookout. And oftentimes, because we're not allowed to talk about religion or politics, we forget the religion and politics. What made your weekend so great? What did you really get to do? What was the most important thing you did over the weekend? There are so many opportunities that are provided for us on a regular basis to confess Jesus. And Jesus says if you confess him, then he'll confess you. But if you deny him, then he will deny you. This is an active process. I want to go back over to 1 Peter for a moment. 1 Peter chapter 3. We had looked at chapter 2. There are a couple times here throughout chapter 2 and chapter 3. Peter says, "To this you were called." One of them here in chapter 2 is to suffer graciously, even unjustly. And that's the verses we had looked at, where Jesus gave us an example that we should follow, that he committed no sin, and there was neither deceit found in his mouth. But here in chapter 3, down there in verse 9, he says, "Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called." Maybe you've talked to some friends or neighbors and they've talked about how they have received a calling. They have a calling from God. Peter says that's accurate wording. You have a calling. You have been called. You've been called to suffer unjustly and graciously, and you've been called to bless. And when we talk about maybe to and forth or in our own brains about what my role is as a Christian, somehow chapter 3 and verse 9 often gets left out. At least in my conversations that I've had and those ones I have in my head, which is a lot and all the time. And if anybody really knew, they'd probably lock me up, how much I talk to myself. But getting back to the text, he mentions here that do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling. And we're happy with that. We are good with that process. If I can be cut off in traffic, if someone can bump me in the grocery store, if a neighbor can throw his garbage over my side of the fence and I don't do it in return, I feel pretty good about myself. But that's not what he says. He says, don't do that, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called. This is the same concept to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good, to seek opportunities to do good to those who have done evil to you. And sometimes we feel so self-satisfied and so self-justified that I've refrained myself from doing evil back to them. And I've never considered that my calling is to bless. When was the last time that I have blessed someone who has done something that just aggravates me? Minor, non-consequential, hasn't hurt me, hasn't hurt my family. Have I been faithful in those small things so that if the big things come up, I can be faithful in the big things? Have I only refrained my mouth from saying the bad things, or have I really given my mouth over to blessing? Consider how Jesus handled those things. How is it that on the cross he can pray that those who are doing this would be forgiven for they don't know what they're doing? It's because he spent a lot of time beforehand blessing over the small things and praying for them in the small things. And when the hard times come, if I'm not practiced and well-versed and have my heart inclined to that, with my mouth well practiced in those things, then my heart is not going to lead me to bless at those times either. We were called to be a blessing with our mouth. As a quick recap, the way that you speak is going to paint the portrait for you. Everybody is going to know who you are by what you choose to say, how you choose to say it, and when you choose to say it. If you do everything else and you don't refrain your tongue, everything else is useless. If we don't get this attribute right of the portrait, might as well stop painting. Because this is a key and major factor in your religion. And there's really no way around it. We are called to have a purity of speech. And that ranges from just the word choices, that ranges then to the topics that we talk about, and also includes who we talk about what to. There are some things that are perfectly fine to talk between you and your spouse and should never, ever be mentioned between you and another person of the opposite gender. That's just the way things are. There are things that may be very appropriate for you to say to somebody else, but may not be appropriate to say to somebody else. We are individuals who have a purity of speech, but not just pure, but ones that is honest and says it in love. If we are individuals who, well, I'm going to be honest, but I don't have a care in the world how it's going to land, then that isn't someone who has the mouth of Christ. Jesus was always thoughtful before he spoke. If you kind of trace some of those things, you'll see that whenever he had the hardest things to say, have you noticed that he goes to a mountain beforehand or a mountain right afterhand? That he takes time after speaking to go off into the wilderness? Before he goes to talk, he sits down. That's one of the really interesting characteristics in John chapter 2. So the money changer at the temple, this is the first time he throws them out. And before he does anything, he sits down. That's it. He sits down and he waits. How often do I do that? How often do I let my mouth speak truth and do it in a loving way? How often do I confess Jesus? Sometimes, again, that's one of those Romans 10:10 is that checklist. I've done it, put it away, don't have to talk about it anymore. But Jesus' statement over in Matthew chapter 10 is an ongoing process, that I have an opportunity to shine my light. And if I deny him before others, then he will deny me before his Father. And I was called to bless. You were called to bless. This is your calling. Your calling is to suffer unjustly, graciously. And your calling is to bless whenever you have been reviled and persecuted. What does your mouth look like? Does it look like Christ? Or does it look like a lot like the world around you? Does someone see you as being distinctly different than your neighbor or your other coworkers? And if they don't recognize by your speech, then maybe you're not nearly as close to the portrait of Christ as you think you are. If they don't know that they are expected to change, if they don't know that your speech is different, if they don't see the grace or the truth in you, then we really need to check how we're doing. Next week we'll pick up hopefully with another attribute of a disciple. But this week I would really like you guys to take some time that next time you look in the mirror, or every time you look in the mirror, that you ask yourself the question, does my mouth reflect Christ? It's maybe a very strange way of phrasing it, maybe a very strange way of thinking of it. But he uses this terminology like we looked at last week, that every day that we look at our eyes, we ask ourselves, do they shine forth Christ? We need to do the same thing with our mouth. Brush your teeth, floss your teeth, whatever you do, ask yourself during that time of the day, has my mouth portrayed Christ? Or has it betrayed Christ? It's going to be doing one or the other. And if we can help you in any way to come to Christ in the first place or to come back to him, let us know as we stand and sing number 291.